So, well, welcome to this talk, and thank you for turning up at week 0. This is a topic, well, I should say, I'm Stefan Dercon here. I'm in the school here as Professor of Economic Policy, and one of the things I do is teaching, introductory economics, essentially, an economics course for the MPP, and as an economist who's been involved in teaching economics, when I was then ended up working in government, I think about 7-8 years ago, I suddenly realized the things you do in government has virtually nothing to do with what you learn in your economics courses. And like one thing, I literally had to start looking for, reading up and starting to begin to understand, is basically something that, seen from a government, is the obvious thing they do all the time. Procurement, regulating the procurement, and basically do an awful lot of public procurement as this kind of obvious things to do. And so one of the striking things is that if you look at the body of research on this topic, it's one of these areas that is essentially virtually not researched, which is really strange because huge amounts of public money depend on it. So it's then a great pleasure to have here today Simeon Djankov and Erika Bossio talking to us about some of the work they're doing. And it's not just because they talk about that topic. Introducing them, you will realize that they actually are within the space of public procurement and in quite an important position, because Simeon Djankov is now the Director of Development Policy in DEC in the World Bank, which is essentially the development economics group, which is basically the place where all the thinking takes place and a lot of the research takes place and the data work takes place and so on, a crucial part of the World Bank. Before that, and he just told me he's still very involved in that, he was a senior director in the office of the chief economist, and that meant and actually also providing advice to the president and the president's office. And he had a whole series of other appointments in the World Bank, but also worked at the LSE, and probably that should be of interest to you too as well. He was a deputy prime minister, just as a side thing, for it's 4 years, Minister of Finance in Bulgaria. So he brings a wealth of experience without both being as an academic, with PhD from Michigan University, an academic career, working in a policy research environment now, and a policy implementation environment, and of course also political environment. So it is really great to have him here. And I'm not sure Erika was kind of reluctant. She will probably get to answer all the questions, so she's the co-author here. And so she's a private sector development specialist at the World Bank, working on things like that some of you will know. She's a co-author of the Doing Business, and for many years she's been doing that, and leads very particular areas, including on public procurement, within the World Bank for the Doing Business, the indicators that they collect on how well countries do in regulatory environment. So Simeon will talk for, he said, about maybe 25 minutes, half an hour. We'll have plenty of time for questions. We only need to be out here by about 6:15. So, I hope you enjoyed the talk, and I hope we'll have a very good discussion. So, Simeon, please, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for coming. I understand that this is week 0, so you can do a lot of fun things, but you decided to be here tonight, and I hope that we can make it fun for you as well. I should say that this is the first time that this project is presented. We hope by today that we would have the paper that goes with it, but we don't have it yet. Our academic authors who are from Harvard universities are less efficient than the World Bank people on the project, so you probably soon, within a week or two, if you're interested in what we're presenting today, would be able to see a working paper. So I'll just present some of the highlights of what has been actually nearly a dozen years in the making of a research project. Usually, even by academic standards, this is fairly long. The main reason for that is that, as Stefan mentioned, even though, and I'll show you some numbers in a moment, public procurement is probably the single most important area of regulation in terms of implications for the way that you run government. And why is that? Because, as I'll show you, a lot of money goes through public procurement regulations in any one country in the world, in rich countries, in middle-income countries, in poor countries. So there is a lot of opportunity to do things right, efficiently, and there is a lot of opportunity to do things wrong and waste a lot of money in the very least because of corruption, because of inefficiencies, and so on. But there is remarkably little written on this project. So if you just look at economics papers, published economics papers on this in this area, there are perhaps less than 10. None of which are regional or global, so they're on specific countries. So this is the first project that looks over a period of time, more or less every country around the world. I'll show you some country examples, and basically ask the question, how do countries regulate public procurement? But beyond that, we'll be asking some broader questions on what is regulation about. And actually, if you're interested in this work, you can go back and look at some of my and my co-authors' previous research that is asking continuously this broader question of what is regulation about, and actually what is government about? Why do we have governments? It seems like it's a very obvious question. We've had governments for a very long period of time, but if you ask the question, what do governments do and what governments should be doing, these are quite different answers that you get over time and then across countries. So the title, the working title of this paper is The Regulation of Government, because unlike the vast majority of research in what's called public economics, basically the field of economics that look at how governments operate, this is actually about how the government regulates itself. Most of the regulation is the government imposes, if you like, regulation on business, environmental regulations, health hazard regulations, business entry regulations, labor regulation, and so on, or on citizens, smoking in public places regulations, regulations on speed of driving, and so on. So it's actually fairly rare to find an area where 100% the government regulates itself. And the reason that this can give us some insights is that, think of you being a government. It's one thing for you to regulate other people, let's say your children. You're very strict. You impose some rules, sometimes reasonable, sometimes not. But if you regulate yourself, you can be either more flexible, if you like, and say, well, I'm already good, so I'm not going to regulate anything. I like myself. Or you can be stricter than to others. So there's also this interesting question that can come from this research, is the government more efficient at regulating itself, or is it much less efficient at regulating itself? And that has implications for the broader question of what a government's about, which is, I guess, why we're all here in this beautiful building. So first, why public procurement matters. I told you the one reason, that this is one of the very few areas, and scientifically, research-wise, this is the main reason. This is regulation that you impose on yourself. Now, that's not quite true, because you can say that it's the politicians that impose regulation on the bureaucrats, if you like, on the administration, that the politicians say, this is how we should run government, and then they say, but while we are honest and incorruptible and very efficient people, the public administration is not, so we want to discipline them. But still, it's the same body of people who run our governments around the world. But also, as Stefan mentioned, this is a hugely important area for how public money is spent. So some numbers here, between 10 and 25% of GDP on average in countries around the world, and this is data that the project has collected, any 1 year basically goes through public procurement. That's about $10 to $11 trillion a year. Just give you how large this amount is. Enough for many corrupt people to do many bad things, or for many very efficient people to do many good things. And an average middle-income country like Brazil, 21% of the share of per capita GDP, or the GDP in any 1 year is spent through public procurement. If you ask the question somewhat more specifically of public expenditure, because this is of the whole economy, 1/5 of what Brazil produces in any 1 year goes through public procurement. If you ask the narrow question of how much of public expenditure goes through procurement, often this is 40 to 50%. So it's huge. And as I said, both the efficiency gains may be huge, as are the opportunities for waste. So then, and as I mentioned also, apart from maybe 6 or 7 country case studies on Hungary, on Germany, Stefan just mentioned one on the United Kingdom, a few on Latin America, there's basically no research that asks the question, how is this regulated and is this efficient or not? So what did we do? So the World Bank, you can say many good things about the World Bank and maybe some bad things. But one of the good things about the World Bank that we have offices in 160 countries around the world. We have people in many countries, well, 160 countries around the world. So we basically know how to collect data if we decide to collect data, because we have access to both the public sector and the private sector in these countries. And we have a project called the Doing Business Project. Some of you may have heard about it, that we started nearly 20 years ago, that goes regulation by regulation and says, tell me how countries around the world regulate startups. Like, how do you start a business in any country around the world was actually the first project. So we collect all the data by law, so what the regulation says, and in practice, what actually happens, and do analysis on it. And in this way, we cover many, many parts of mostly business regulation. So how does the government regulate business? So this project is a component, if you like, of this larger Doing Business project, because public procurement essentially is the government wants to produce, wants to either build a road or build a hospital or supply hospital with medical supplies, or supply schools with textbooks and so on. But they don't produce it themselves. Often is not the case that the government also produces textbooks or medical supplies or builds roads. They have to basically contract a private company to do it. So the regulation is really, you can think of it this way, is that the government wants to do something. It can be a service like building a road, or in this case, maintenance of an existing road. Or it can be a particular good, like buying pencils. Or it can be a number of other services that the government provides, both for business and actually for citizens. And then we ask the question, how does this actually happen? How does the government provide this service? To be very concrete, I'll show in a minute, we ask for a particular case, which is the maintenance of a 20-kilometer road that goes from the capital city to another city close by. So we hypothetically design a case, so it's the same across every country in the world. And we've tried many different cases, from medical supplies to Xerox machines to roads, to make sure that it's comparable across countries, that we're not missing something specific to the countries. And then what we do, you see here, so we design a standardized case study and questionnaire that we send to every country in the world in their own language, so that there is no language barrier. And then in this particular case, we say, well, it's about constructing roads, so construction firms should know about this, procurement entities should know about this, lawyers, because they often, in many countries around the world, act on behalf of the government, should know about this, and of course the government procurement officials, which may be the Ministry of Infrastructure, or the Ministry of Finance, or the Ministry of Environment, would know about this. And then we send these surveys, in this case more than 1,000 surveys to get the answers. And then we go through this repetitive process of going back and forth with respondents over a fairly long period of time to make sure that they send us all the relevant laws, all the relevant regulations, so we have them and make them public on our website to get to the answers that I'll start showing you in a moment. So in other words, this project has potentially two value-added features. One feature is that if you want to know something about public procurement, which is actually a fairly boring topic, so not many of you should necessarily focus on it, but if you did, We literally have 490 countries around the world, everything that you want to know in terms of the regulation and administration of public procurement. The reason for that is that we hope that other academics will pick up this data as they have in other areas and will do a lot of research, and that your professors will give you very difficult and complicated assignments that you would have to do while you study here. And then we have on top of this data some of the analysis, initial analysis that I'll be showing you right now. So what I'll do is that I will show you a series of graphs, essentially, figures, that have 190 countries, so the dots that you see are 190 countries around the world. The UN has 196 members at the moment. The World Bank has 191 members. So basically, every country that is part of the World Bank is part of this data set. And then we ask a series of relatively simple questions. And the questions will be related to this very basic question that I started with. Is the regulation that the government designed efficient or not? So in this case, if you're thinking of the maintenance of a road, we can relatively quickly, without even being economists, decide what are efficiency vectors. So like, what would you want as an outcome variable, as outcomes from an efficient regulation? Well, if we are maintaining a road or supplying anything, you want it to be relatively cheap and also relatively fast. So these are the two main dimensions, and good quality. So these are three dimensions that you can argue for anything that the government produces, or procures rather, to give to the public or businesses, can be captured by these three things: fast, relatively cheap, and then good quality. So one question that we ask is this one. So how long does it take in the average country to do this very basic project, which is you have 20 kilometers of road and you just need to resurface it, basically. This is what maintenance is about. Many cars have driven on it, and now you just need to resurface it. And what we ask here, notice, so we ask two questions. By law, how long it would take, and in practice, how long it would take. The reason that law and practice can differ, and I'll show you in a moment, is that, well, in some countries, actually, they don't follow the law. So they have laws, but nobody follows. This is a common assumption, let's say, for many developing countries. Or, in the opposite direction, and we'll show you some evidence in rich countries, that the law actually mandates relatively little, but because of business culture or ethics or basically previous precedent, actually the practice imposes more, if you like, than the law. So we'll see some pictures like that. But first the question is, how long does it take to do a project? So inconveniently for non-economists, the time is presented as the natural logarithm of the number of days. Should be presented in days so that it's more striking. But Venezuela, which is VN at the top, you can see Venezuela, Haiti, Angola, Botswana, Chile, Greece, Luxembourg, Korea are the countries that we've chosen just for fun, Korea being the most time efficient. So in Venezuela, if you follow the rules, you follow what the law suggests, so don't cut any corners, don't get involved in corruption and so on, it takes you on average 10 years to basically not to build the road or not to resurface the road, just to go for the procedures to be able to do it. So this is important. The time does not include the actual work. It basically stops before the work is done. So 10 years to resurface the road. Haiti takes, again, these are logs, so a bit difficult to see, but in Haiti it takes about 8.5 years, and if you say, well, but these are poor countries, so they're just not efficient enough and so on, then you have Greece, you have Chile, where it takes on average about 7.5, 8 years. You have other countries like Italy, like Spain, like France, that take about 5 to 6 years to follow the rules. You could say, well, maybe there's a good reason for that, that if you follow the rules, you get much higher quality. So we'll see whether that's the case. And how do you get higher quality? Well, in economics, we say if you make sure that the most efficient contractor, the firm that is most efficient, builds with highest quality, actually gets the contract and delivers, then we are reasonably certain that we have high quality. And to cut to the end of the story, basically that's not true. So what I'll be showing you here, that in very rich countries, in middle-income countries, and in poor countries, the regulation of procurement gets you exactly the wrong outcome. So it delays the process, makes it more expensive, brings low quality through higher collusion, low competition, more bribes, and a variety of other not so nice effects. And then we'll get to the answer, but why then? Why do you regulate that way? Overrun. So overrun, this is, again, the same countries. Overrun is basically cost overrun. So every project, when you design it, when the government designs it, the engineers basically go look at the 20 kilometers worth of road to be resurfaced, and they say, this should cost, let's say, 10 million pounds, because they've made the calculations of similar roads in the past, or just because of what the engineering of it is. So what the overrun variable means is that given what was the initial estimate for this project done by the government, how much more, starting from zero, which means they exactly hit the project, so Singapore is the only country that comes close, to basically they overrun at least twice, which is Zimbabwe, Venezuela, Bolivia, Japan, interestingly, Luxembourg, and so on. You can think of this, if you like, as a markup. So if you're doing a project and you are imposing some markup, efficient economics suggests that it should be close to zero if it's truly competitive. Then you go to, let's forget Venezuela, it has many other issues, but country like Japan, reasonable OECD countries, and think, what is the markup of basically maintaining roads? And the answer is the markup is more than 80%. So in other words, the government spends 80% more than the actual cost of producing this. So as a taxpayer, I'd be very pissed if I were in Japan. But since I'm not, I'm just documenting it. Luxembourg, a reasonable European country, about 60% markup. Is this a good thing or not? We're not commenting now. We're just documenting what we're just documenting. So actually, the only country that sort of the market seems to operate well is Singapore. So you produce roughly at cost. Delay, so I showed you just time, which was the actual amount of time by law that, if you follow the rules. Delay is a slightly different variable, which says, given what the government mandated in the documents of the average procurement project, how much actually the project was over that, so to speak. So how much more time it took on average. So this is not an extreme case. This is the average case. Again, Singapore seems to be both quick and on the cost. And you see a number of other countries they're repeating. So basically, time and cost seem to be highly correlated in this. That basically blow up the time by about twice as long as it should take. We have a number of other such pictures to suggest that most countries in the world are actually not great. Then we go to the regulation itself and say, why is that the case? Maybe there is a reason for it. Maybe we are losing some time and we are imposing some extra costs, but we're getting something in return. Because the idea of efficient government is that the citizens, the businesses, should be getting something good from the government levying taxes. So all the regulations of the process of the public procurement process, we divide into 4 groups. And we have lots of lawyers and some people like yourselves who went through top MPA programs or other public policy programs. So we basically have very smart people on our side and on the Harvard side to look at this regulation. And we divide into 4 different areas. Accountability, and we give some examples of what these areas are, what the regulator thought they are regulating. So it can be accountability to make sure that no silly things are happening. Competition, to make sure that regulation of competition, to make sure that as many firms participate in the process. Transparency, which is basically the public, any public, the media, citizens, NGOs, competitors know exactly what's happening in the process, so how open the information is. And then risk management, which is where the government should care a lot about, making sure that you have quality subcontractors, contractors, materials, and so on, so that you don't end up with shoddy materials or subcontractors that don't really know how to build a road. So every part of the regulation, once we have the regulations, we've basically put in one of these four categories. This is lots of law and regulation, so lots of work going behind it. And then we also divide the whole sample of 190 countries into high income, middle income, and low income. And the reason that we do that is basically to see whether perhaps a regulation is different by income level, because there are many theories of government that say, well, if you have a lot of government abilities, basically if your government is staffed with top people and uses the latest technology and so on, they can enforce better regulation than if this is a government with limited resources. So you should expect, and actually a lot of economic theory goes in that direction, that high-income countries actually have more regulation. Low-income countries have fewer regulations because from an efficiency perspective, they probably can enforce less. So we test that, and then we specify to, given the level of regulation, do they achieve the right outcomes? And with some minor exceptions, the answer is no. Nobody achieves the right outcome. So before showing you the final kind of set of slides on outcomes and who achieves what, let me state that there are at least three theories of regulation. I already mentioned a lot of this. The first theory is the most obvious. I've discussed it already, that the governments want through their regulation to achieve efficiency. In other words, for the process to be cheap, high quality, and on time. And we test that. We have enough data to test that. I should say not only from our survey, but there are other World Bank data sets exactly on building roads that we can empirically test with this regulation what was the actual outcome. Another theory of regulation is that the governments basically don't know a priori what they are doing, but they're looking at what's happening in the world, business world, or with consumers, with voters. And when there is some sort of a bad outcome, let's say a bridge collapses, happens a lot in Italy lately, then they respond to it with regulation. They go research why the, find out in some way why the bridge collapsed, and then they impose the right regulations so no other bridges collapse in the future. So in other words, here regulation is more responsive, if you like, to what's happening in the world. So there is a precedent, you address it. Then there is something else, you address it. And this is incidentally consistent with the rise of regulation, because if you look how government has developed over time, not just in this area, in any area, one striking pattern is how much larger governments are becoming over time, what share of GDP they take, what share of overall resources. So bureaucracies, with the exception of the UK lately, in the last decade or so, but most bureaucracies in the world are actually expanding very, very tremendously over time. And the share of GDP that the government uses is also expanding at quite high rates. So one theory that is emerging is because there are so many bad outcomes around that we try to fix everyone as best as we can. The third area, which there is much less research, but we are hopefully with this project adding to it, is saying it's not really about efficiency, it's not really even about outcomes. So the government mostly cares about themselves. So they don't care about whether the bridge falls or not, although ideally bridges shouldn't fall. And they don't care whether it's cheap or expensive and so on, although ideally it should be cheap. What they care essentially to be in power. And to be in power, you need to have legitimacy. Basically, people need to trust you. That legitimacy may be fake or not fake. This is why we call it perceived legitimacy. And basically what the governments are trying to do is to say, I need to stay longer in power. To do that, I need to be perceived to increase my legitimacy. So I need to do things that people like and businesses like. And whether it's the right outcome or not, it's a different topic. But I need this increased legitimacy. So there is a large literature, for example, on environmental regulations, that essentially says, well, many governments actually didn't believe until very recently in climate change and so on, but they were doing it because a large part of the electorate thought that that's the right thing to do, and they did it for legitimacy, essentially to stay in power. I've been in politics. I can tell you the vast majority of politicians around the world care about themselves. They don't really care about the rest of society much. They want to stay in power as long as they can. So I already discussed time and efficiency. The other outcomes that we follow in this work is, as I mentioned, to get to the right level of quality, ideally you shouldn't have collusion across companies. You shouldn't have favoritism so that you know which company is going to be chosen in advance. Certainly you shouldn't have bad quality. You should have competition, because without competition you don't really go far in quality and cost and so on. And bribes, generally speaking, we know from other literature, are associated with bad outcomes. Not for the person receiving the bribe necessarily, or giving the bribe, but for the public. So we also follow these outcomes. We collect a lot of data on them, and we simply ask the question, given the regulations, are they actually reducing bribes, reducing collusion, favoritism, increasing quality and increasing competition or not? So we just document it around the world. So I'll show you a few pictures and then I'll stop. One thing which is very interesting academically, actually, that we haven't fully thought through how to present, is that in this work, and actually in much of the other work around the Doing Business project, we make a distinction of what's on the books. I already mentioned this. So what actually the regulator or the parliament or the executive said that they want to do and put it in writing, and in fact what happens. And actually the striking parts are the first and the third. So in high-income countries, which is to the right, essentially the law suggests one thing and governments overdo it. In other words, they put more than what the regulation suggests. And as I said, that may be for good reason. So there's ethical conduct or just behavior by businesses or society at large that demands that. So if you don't have to write it, because that's, if you like, the culture of the country. While in low-income countries, it's exactly the opposite. So the law actually suggests more than twice as much as what which is to the left, than in practice, actually, the regulators do. What does this mean? Somebody wrote the law, maybe the World Bank, maybe somebody else, and actually nobody follows the law. At least many people don't follow the law, including the regulators themselves. So it's not the firms not following the law. This is the government not following its own laws. In middle-income countries, it's actually about the same. Not as striking, but basically, in many cases, what's on the law or in the law is not really followed in practice. So I'm concluding with a number of some of the variables that you already saw, some of the variables that you didn't, across income groups. And the point that I'll be making is that nearly every type of regulation across every type of country doesn't work, or gets you actually a worse outcome than you thought you would have to begin with. Just one exception, transparency in low-income countries. So it seems that if you wanted to regulate anything, you should regulate transparency, so basically putting information about public procurement, meaning what are you going to build, how long it's going to take, who is winning it, why, how long did it take, and so on, for the public, but meaning for everybody, for the media, for the non-governmental organizations, be it environmental or others, or ones that just care about public money not being spent in vain. And any other type of regulation is either irrelevant, essentially, it doesn't give you better outcomes, or worse, actually worsens the outcomes. So here is an example of overrun. So did you actually spend more than you are supposed to spend in low-income countries? So this is a good, basically, if it's downward falling, overrun basically means the higher you are Yemen, so you spend more than you should have. Transparency, as you go towards one, it means you have more transparency, so more of your documents are in the public domain, be it online or be it accessible otherwise. And if it's a downward sloping, that means more transparency actually reduced overruns. This is ideally what you'd like to see. So I mentioned already this, that transparency, very simple, doesn't cost you much. You just put everything that you're doing on online, let's imagine it this way, and hope that inquisitive students or media or anybody else actually looks at it and through, if you like, public pressure, reduces the opportunity for cost overruns. Once you look at middle-income countries, however, that basically falls out. So it's more or less flat. Statistically, there is no correlation. So already, even transparency in middle-income countries like Brazil, Russia, and so on, doesn't give you much. Once you go to high-income countries, like the UK, like Germany, like France, and so on, think of Europe mostly, Japan, Korea, and so on, somewhat counterintuitively, actually transparency gets you in the other direction. It in fact increases the overruns. At first you think that cannot be true. I mean, how can it be that if you have more information, in rich countries that can enforce, you actually end up with high overruns? I'll let this question linger a bit and then we'll answer it at the end with what we have. Favoritism. So I said that in transparency seems to be the only variable or the only type of regulation that works only in low-income countries. But then you say, well, maybe transparency works in other areas. So favoritism is basically a variable that says, when the government started this process, did they already know essentially who would win it? Which you would think no, because you have this long regulation and process. But actually, in many cases, that's the case. So, good news, in poor countries, favoritism falls with transparency. So here we have a good outcome as well, making this point that if you don't know what to do, just make it as transparent as possible in low-income countries. But look at middle-income countries, it goes the other way, statistically significant. So once you basically try to put regulation on or not having favoritism, in other words, to eliminate the possibility, that actually goes the other way. And once you go to high-income countries, this is Croatia, Portugal, I don't know what PAM is, Panama maybe, it also goes the other way. In other words, regulation, somewhat perversely, favoritism gives you more, or the transparency of what you're doing in the process gives you more favoritism. Bribes, I'm now quickly going through this. So what is the incidence of bribes during the process? Transparency in low-income countries actually reduces bribes, great news. No effect in middle-income countries. Somewhat positively correlated, so if you have more transparencies, bribes actually increase in rich countries. And I'll move away now from transparency for the moment, or not for the moment, because you remember we had 4 categories: risk management, accountability, transparency, and competition, yes. So to see whether other things work. And the answer is basically none of the other 3 areas of regulation give us anything particularly important. Middle-income countries, if you have more accountability, which basically says you're putting regulation on making sure that the firms responsible for the public, for the building, or in this case maintenance, give the right kind of accounts, if you like, to the government, what they did, how they did it, and so on. You would think that that should reduce the need for favoritism, because that firm, even if it's the favorite firm, should actually produce better. It does not. You go to high-income countries, again, it goes the opposite direction. In this case, not statistically significant, but still, it's actually not helping us, accountability in this system. In low-income countries, accountability actually helps somewhat with reducing bribes. So something is happening in developing countries that is good. Once you go to risk management and competition, nothing works anywhere. So basically, if you didn't have regulation, you'd be at least as well off. But in some countries, particularly in rich countries, actually even better off. So I'll answer why we think this is the case, noting that this is research in progress. But what are the preliminary findings of this research? So it seems that countries over-regulate in the sense that they impose a lot of regulation that has no social value. It does not give you the outcomes that you that you would like to get. And also, not only you're not getting the outcomes, but in fact, it's not reducing the time, it's not reducing the cost, it seems to be actually increasing both time and cost. Then you ask the question, but how can that be around the world? Because as I mentioned, there's this very rich literature in other areas of regulation, financial markets regulation, for example, or environmental regulation, that very clearly says poor countries cannot enforce or have simpler regulations up to a point. Rich countries can enforce or have heavy, stricter regulations. What we find here is that actually in rich countries you don't really need much regulation because their practice is well above the regulation anyhow. So somehow they have other ways to try to achieve optimal outcomes. Again, that may be culture. You know, there's always the story that the Swedes and the Danish and so on are just good people to begin with, so you don't really need to regulate them, while the Italians and Greeks and others are corrupt, so you need to regulate them a lot. And then when you go to poor countries, there is actually a body of literature. These results go a bit against it, that say that even if you wanted to have the right regulation, you cannot implement, so might as well not bother and have some very simple regulation, that the capacity of government is there. And to note the one consistently coming positive result, which is that in poor countries, it seems that the transparency of the process is the only unambiguously good, if you like, regulation. That if you're in doubt what to do, particularly in countries without much capacity, make it as open to the public as possible. The good feature of that is that it's free. Essentially, you're just putting information outside. So I'll finish just with one comment, which is that how can it be that in rich, reasonably well-functioning countries, putting more regulation, kind of it seems to be in the right direction, is giving you not just zero, but negative outcomes? How can that be? Maybe it's not efficient, so that's why it should be zero, but it cannot be going in the opposite direction. So there we rely on admittedly smaller literature, but here the empirical results are the most robust, which basically says, well, think of regulation with our third thing, so the government needs legitimacy. So they're basically trying to impose, to show that they're doing something in the public good, but they don't know what to do, so who do they ask? Well, they ask the firms that are the business community, the firms that are doing this. And since this is relatively specialized, so not everybody can build a hospital or build or maintain a road, basically they end up asking the few large firms in their country or internationally that know how to do this. And these firms, very rationally for themselves, say, you should impose more regulation. What does this regulation do? Well, the regulation shrinks the competition. It makes it impossible for smaller firms or for new entrants to come into the market because they don't know how to do this. It's only the large firms that are already in the market and know how to do. So with every fallen bridge, with every broken road, with every hurricane and so on, fewer and fewer firms actually can do the work because politicians want to look legitimate, to appear to be doing the good. They ask in one way or another, could be lobbying, could be just they're naive, could be that they really thought that this is the right thing to do. They ask the few market participants who are there, and very rationally they say, you should do this, you should do this. What they're imposing is essentially entry barriers. So at the end, and we have this in a number of countries around the world, you end up with one or two firms that in fact can do the project. If you're these firms, what do? Even if you're 2 or 3 or 4, because this is a repeated game, you basically agree with each other and say, I'll take this project, you take the next project, and we'll bid as if we are competing, but we're not actually competing with you. And you end up with more delays, higher costs, less quality, because there is no competition. So I'll finish with this thought. Maybe that's what's happening. We have a lot of evidence over many years to suggest this. Here, when we started this project, we certainly did not expect that this would be the outcome. We actually expected that a lot of regulations in rich countries like the UK, who is very excited about procurement regulation, would get you the right outcomes, and then would be asking how to basically translate this into developing countries where the World Bank is most interested in, so that the same type of regulation, but maybe somewhat simpler, applies. What we found in some sense is actually much more alarming than we thought. Essentially, we find in rich countries the regulation is captured by business in many instances. So it's artificially high. It excludes everybody, so it's costly, it's inefficient. And maybe organizations like the World Bank, but we're a good organization, it's more the IMF and others, impose this regulation on poor countries, and they get either nothing or actually negative results, except for transparency. So I'll leave you with the thought of more transparency is good. Stefan.
Well, okay. Well, thank you very much. Well, thank you for the come and sit here, maybe, and we can take some questions. I'm sure that this has lifted us all up, and looking. I mean, is there anything positive that you can take away here?
Transparency works almost too well in developing countries. We first thought, how can it be? Because it's exactly the countries where perhaps the internet doesn't work all the time, or the media may be captured and so on. But it's like universally and very strongly across every set of outcomes and intermediate outcomes like collusion and so on, it works. It's a bit of a mystery, frankly, to me. But maybe the logic behind it is just so simple that this is the only regulation that you can impose in a country that otherwise the government is either corrupt or inefficient or just doesn't have enough capacity. So basic level of transparency. There's some second, if you like, tier results that say actually some regulation, again transparency, maybe some risk management in middle income countries also reduces the time. Maybe increases the cost, but that trade-off may be okay if you build things fairly efficiently. Time-wise, maybe that's what you want to do, but it's just in a small section of indicators in middle-income countries. And once you go to rich countries, there isn't anything positive to say. Like, it all goes the opposite direction. Now there you can say, well, maybe there is, we know that among some rich countries, there is always the Southern Europeans that are terrible in everything other than coffee making, perhaps, and baguettes. So you would get the bad outcomes there anyhow. So you're trying to put more regulation to avoid them, but it's kind of chicken and egg situation. So we've had a lot of thought of how to account for this. And even if you account for this, that some regulation comes because more bridges are falling in Italy than, let's say, in the UK or Sweden, still you get this very perverse outcome. And that's actually a very negative outcome, because it says if businesses cheat or collude with the government in the best countries, so to speak, I mean, what hope do we have for other countries? But that's where you have this brand new set of students and some other students that will change that.
Very good. Let's take some questions. There's lots of hands. I'm going to take 3 at a time. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
And then, that means at least 3 rounds we'll have to do. Why don't we start, lady at the back?
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry.
Take your microphone, because this is streamed.
I
should warn you that this is streamed as well, so that you know that you're saying things that other people outside this building will hear as well.
Wow. Thank you. Very interesting talk. I didn't expect a procurement talk to be so interesting.
Neither did I, frankly.
So very fast. So I have 2 questions. The first is, you base it on the data collected from the governments. What if the governments are corrupt and they manipulate, fudge, or hide the data? And the second is, how do you penalize or hold the governments accountable? Or rather, how do you enforce transparency in some of the poor countries? And I'm basing this in context of a particular government and case that's...
that shall remain unknown to the audience.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yes.
So.
Good. Yes, gentleman behind you there. Yeah.
Thanks. All very interesting. You focused your analysis on overruns and I guess then cost is what that leads to. But did you also look at quality? And if so, how does that factor into it?
Okay. And I'm looking for a third one somewhere at the... Where was that? At the... Can I see some of the hands at the back there? That was, otherwise we'll have to come forward. So we come a bit forward here. Is that okay? To the second row. And then, oh, sorry. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you. Your conclusion and your presentation sort of seem to imply that more competition, in line with neoclassical economic view maybe, that more competition will lead to more efficient outcomes. But it seemed to me when you were discussing cost overruns, you measured it as a markup over the promises that were made, in the initial bid. And could there not be a countervailing effect whereby more competition produced more overruns because there was a competitive bidding process of promises? And so the more competition there is, the more they're encouraged to make lower and lower bids, a bit also like election promises.
Yeah, no, it's a very good.
Well, why don't you answer?
It's a very good point. So let me try to answer this this round. So to note that the data are not only from the government. In fact, they're mostly from the business actors, the construction firms or other firms that may be involved, law firms, these are private law firms that may be involved in the bidding process. In the vast majority of countries around the world, many of the construction companies for large projects don't have their own capacity, so they hire intermediaries, accounting firms, law firms, and so on. So we actually use their answers as well as the answers of the government. If the government was cheating, so to speak, which is exactly what I would expect as well, you don't get these results. I mean, if we got exactly the opposite results, which is that the regulation is great and you're getting the right outcomes, you kind of would say, well, maybe the government officials are not telling us the right story. But it's striking how opposite to that the results are. So it's basically saying that even if the government is trying to paint a rosy picture from the agencies and so on, actually the situation is worse than what we are suggesting. But you're right. If we only depended on them and it went the other way, okay, we need to rethink the strategy. So then, given that, I would say that this is the lower bound of inefficiency. Probably the inefficiency is actually more so than we pictured it here. So then the question is, well, what do you do? Because this presentation is, as Stefan kind of politely implied, like not a very positive Thursday evening, let's go and have feel good about the government and so on. So then what do you do? Basic level of transparency. So that's where it interplays with media. So it seems that, and we have some other projects in this field to suggest, there are lots of issues with the independence of media around the world, or in general, the rest of the public. But it seems that in this area, perhaps because so much money is at stake, or that there are particular non-governmental organizations that follow this, and we know actually in some countries that's the case, it's not the government that is actually doing something good, it's through the basic information availability, the rest of society actually is doing something for the government. So this is very much a kind of a democracy story. Put the data out, and then this data would be used by other actors in a more efficient way than if just the government agencies were doing it. So then you just need to, your second question, basically make sure that the government does it. And some governments do, many governments don't. But at least this is, if we, let's say at the World Bank, knew that this is an area, we can push and say, unless you do that, we are not going to do projects with you. And then you go to different countries and then find out, which we know, okay, if you're in China, there seems to be very little transparency, how exactly projects are done, who wins them, and so on. But many countries around the world, I think the government, I've been a former finance minister, so I can tell if somebody comes to me and says, you can save 60% of any one project by putting data on online, even if the Minister of Infrastructure doesn't want to do it, I can assure you it's going to happen because I'm saving money that I can spend somewhere else. So I think that is kind of a basic level of efficiency of regulation you can do. Beyond that, we simply don't know. It doesn't seem that there is much of a hook to say what else to do yet. Maybe we'll find more as the project matures. Quality. So there are some studies that look at quality, and actually we have such outcomes. We didn't report them here. So one way to, again, this is a project that looks at resurfacing of a road. So one measure of quality of resurfacing of the road, that is an outcome measure, is if the road actually is well built, you should be able, all else equal, to travel faster on it. So average speed on this road should actually be faster. So there are no holes, you don't have to kind of go around and do it. So there's Google Maps, you probably use it a lot, so it has satellite pictures. So actually for every country that we've looked for a number of roads around the country, so you'd see that when the paper is put, we actually follow over a period of time what the average speed is. for this project to see whether that as a proxy for quality gives us kind of the outcomes that we expect. So higher regulation gives you more speed, and the answer is no. Actually, it goes remarkably in the direction that that I showed you a bit earlier. There are more resource-intensive measures of quality that World Bank has used on other projects, which is to say you go to every road, you dig in, so basically you take a measure of 10 square centimeters of the road and basically just see for consistency of the asphalt and so on. For World Bank projects, so for a subset of the project, which is where the World Bank money went into it, so the government still implemented it, but the World Bank money went into it, we actually have such measures. So we can see whether quality is better or not. This is part of the analysis that I'm not presenting today because it's very new. And the answer is, by and large, no. So you're not buying quality with the type of regulation that you're getting. It's not necessarily that quality is reduced everywhere, but you're certainly not buying this quality. And then the final question on, can it be that competition basically reduces the front price? Very good question. That does happen often, actually. We see that in order to win a bid, often companies basically underbid. Why? Because later they'll play the regulation. They'll say, I'll underbid now, even below cost, but if I win the contract, then 2 months after, I would say, well, sorry, but I cannot build it for this price because, you know, a natural spring just came out in the middle of the road and I need additional work and so on. So we thought about what you say is actually happens a lot in practice. So you can play with, let's say, time. Maybe you can play with cost, but then you shouldn't be able to play with quality, which is the other point, and I should have spoken more about speed. So somehow, some way you should gain. So maybe time, and in middle-income countries, I said, there is somewhat of a trade-off between time and cost. But somehow there is no trade-off with quality. So quality is universally bad given what you pay off. And it's not just, and I finish with this, so it's not just competition. If it was just competition, then the classical theory or the neoclassical theory that you mentioned, we worry about that. But we also look at favoritism, we also look at bribes, you know, and it goes in the same direction. So if, you know, competition was increasing, let's say, but then bribes were decreasing, okay, maybe we can have a story. It's just what's remarkable about this project is that all the bad outcomes are going in the same direction. So you must wonder what really is happening with this regulation. Are governments so clueless, really, that they haven't seen this? Stefan's informal interpretation before is they never use economy, so people who studied at the Blavatnik School, so really governments have no idea what's done.
Okay, oops. Let's start at the back. Lady there, yes, you. Yes, it is you. It is you.
The mic is coming.
The mic is coming.
Hello, I'm Kaushalya. I really liked your talk.
Thank you.
I just really, I was curious to know if you found any differences between, let's say, countries where they're more centralized versus countries with decentralized federal structures, especially when it comes to fiscal federalism, when you have a certain party which forms the national government, whereas the state government is formed by an opposition party. Did you find any challenges there?
I understand the question, yes. Very good
Thank
question.
you so much.
Okay, the gentleman there to the side, and then we'll come forward.
Thank you for your talk, which is very interesting. My first question is that regulation is not needed in rich countries. Certainly comes as a price, and but that's why I would like to know more about the definition of regulation. I mean, in the procurement trade, some principles really come as basic knowledge, like you always use open tendering as the default. You have to put in place a segregation of duties for different officers involved. You have to keep an audit trail, and if you need negotiation, you have different people on the same team as a check and balance. So do these things count as regulation? Do we need to do away with these even basic principles? And my second question is that in quite a few public bodies that are not run on commercial principles, revenue contract is not an important aspect, so the rules are often just a mirror image of the procurement of expenditure contracts. So have you done anything or research on procurement of revenue contracts, and is there any insight in this aspect? Thank you.
So, what contracts? Revenue contracts?
Revenue contracts.
Revenue-based contracts.
Okay.
Okay. So come forward here with with the white scarf here. Yeah, can pass it on.
So that's like PPP, or what is meant by revenue contracts?
Do you mean?
Is this public-private partnerships, or what do you mean by revenue contracts? Sorry.
Definition is quite wide. Public-private partnership contract is definitely one type of that, but pretty simply, if, for example, a Blavatnik School of government wants to rent out this place for commercial use, or want to put in some vending machine, there are also some kind of procurement, but for revenue, not for expenditure.
So you look at outsourcing. Okay, understand.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much. So given that there is a discrepancy with efficiency when it comes to low-income countries as to when it comes to rich-income countries, does this mean that for emerging economies there's a point at which the government needs to pull back on regulations? And where would you say is that point?
Okay.
Very good. So first question, federal versus state level. We haven't in our research gotten there yet, but there are some papers, particularly coming from Latin America, that indeed suggest that if you have even like some competition within the government, so different layers of the government, especially if they're from different parties, and maybe they're not even doing it for the efficiency, they're just doing it to kind of piss off each other or to make sure that the other party doesn't get much in terms of bribes and so on, there seems to be more efficiency. So in other words, competition within the government, layers of government, seems to come with better outcomes. And there is some evidence from Brazil on this, not on roads, but on basically pencils and hospital supplies and so on. Competition within the government is good. In our case, because we've standardized it very much, so it's a bit more difficult to test exactly that. Although you're right, we can test whether the capital city, because our road is from the capital city to a nearby city, whether the capital city, the mayor of the capital city is from the opposing party, and then see whether different outcomes would come. So actually, we can do that. The question on so what's regulation? So we ask a series of questions, not just specific to procurement law. So if some other law actually has an answer to that question, we also take that into account. So in other words, we ask, is it an open bidding procedure for this type of a road? Does the procurement law or any other law suggest that it should be open bidding procedure or not? And if it's not in a law, we basically say 0. And if it's in some type of a law, we say 1. To start with. So many countries, you suggested that many countries indeed mandate that it should be open bidding procedures. But then you read the law and it says, well, it should be open bidding procedure, but first the government actually gathers a few firms, talks to them kind of over coffee, and then has the open bidding procedure, and suddenly most of them don't really apply to the procedure, and that's in the law. So if that's in the law that the government, like we are here, imagine you're all firms and I'm the government. So I come and say, this is a great contract, you'll basically do great if you take it, but if any of you I see applying, bad things would happen to you, so don't even think about it. So only you can apply, only you can apply. So this type of regulation, so you understand, so it's not that we're looking just at a local procurement law. We are thinking of how the process goes, kind of in an ideal situation. So Erica and her team of legal experts think of what are the types of procedures that in all cases perhaps should be there, and then what's on top of these procedures, and say, law by law, does any law regulate it or not? And what you find is that in some of the, perhaps not surprising, some of the Anglo-Saxon countries, New Zealand, Australia, even the UK, actually the law doesn't say much. So it's a much shorter law than you would say in France, Germany, and so on. And it basically almost operates on the basis of, if you like, contract law. So it says, the government is basically just another entity, and it has some sort of a contract with a private entity. If the private entity somehow has fraud or bad quality and so on, you go to the courts. And then the government just sues the private entity for damages and so on. So you don't need regulation. In other words, there is a trade-off between judges on the one hand, in countries like the UK, New Zealand, Australia, but also Denmark, Sweden, some of the Nordic countries. So you don't impose the regulation. Once you go beyond this type of countries, everybody seems to regulate and regulate a lot. So this is the definition of regulation is any law, anything that's written by the government or the legislator, tell us what to do in a particular area. And then once you go down this road, your second question on outsourcing, do we look at outsourcing? So our case is very specific to this particular road, so we know exactly what laws and regulations apply. So I cannot directly answer your question of, you know, if you are basically in every school you want to put some drinks or snacks for kids, what happens in terms of revenue contracts? No, we don't. This project is not about that. You would think that the opportunity for cheating there is much higher, because here you see the road. You know, it's either there or it's not there. 20 kilometers, you know exactly where the road is. You can actually see it from Google Maps. And we have, as I mentioned, in the World Bank, an EBRD, an African Development Bank portfolio. We know which road was built for how money, for how long, and we see it from the sky. With the revenue contracts that you say, and then public procurement and others are even more complicated, probably doing this project will give you even more complication, just to research it, to find out. And then the last comment on, are you saying that there should be less regulation? Don't know yet. Once we read the paper, we'll have comments on that. What we are for certain saying is that a number of regulations currently in place do not serve useful public purpose, do not. And actually in rich countries they go the other way. They in fact hurt the public. So from that you can go two ways. You can see, and therefore it's actually better if there are no such regulations, because then if we go with this collusion of firms and the government, and only a few firms can actually do the project, so they actively push the government towards more regulation. And we've provided, if you like, the platform for collusion. Then removing the platform should actually make collusion less obvious. So that's the one direction, and certainly this is kind of a right-wing type of government coming to power. They may consider this. I'll be more careful on that, because then which regulation do you remove becomes kind of a secondary topic. I think the vector in which we should be thinking, if this results maintain and are actually a bit broader, is why is it that this is happening? So why is it that with this maybe well-intentioned governments, these outcomes, and is there another way, and if it is legitimacy, that governments are really seeking legitimacy through this process, is there another way for governments to seek this legitimacy without imposing this extra time costs and other costs for the public? I think in that area there is actually a lot of research, not mostly coming from economics, but coming actually from, if you like, business schools, public schools, on kind of the behavior of governments. How do you get to be respected, if you like, in a government? And either stay in power or kind of do good things. So it moves you away from economics, but I understand that many of you are not economists, or at least not mostly economists, and basically says it's not just about money, it's not just about the efficiency of the process, because we are certainly not getting efficient processes here. It's about how government should behave and how government should serve their citizens. And it gets you to ethics, it gets you basically to the structure, to the political structure of a country, which is why one of the answers, which the lady at the back said, you know, if you have a structure within politics that is more competitive, so in that case it's very clear, because, you know, if the mayor of the largest city is from the opposition party, the federal government wants to make sure he or she doesn't get much money, so they have the desire to reduce costs and she on them. Suddenly this competition within the government gives you the right outcomes. But this is in the field of political science, if you like, rather than economics.
Good. We have time for, I think, final rounds. I'm going to take, okay, these four, gentleman there, and then two, and then the lady here in front.
And you
And
can
you were waiting
Yeah.
for a long time, so I'm going to get 5 questions. Yeah. Yes, please go ahead.
Thank you. I would like to know if
Please,
this...
one question each, because we're going to run out of time.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you. I would like to know if this study did consider the lobbying regulation or the lobbying framework or standards from each country that you analyzed.
Good. Yeah.
Thanks for your talk. I would like to know, how did you normalize the methodology of procurement? You know, for example, in the same case of maintenance of road, you can have the reverse bidding, you know, the lowest price bid or the QCBC, all kind of methods. Now, each of these have got, you know, your variables. You know, if you take the base itself at a different levels. So how did you normalize that?
Okay. And next to you there.
Hi, thank you. So my question is that, do you think that it's important at all for the World Bank to look at trying to distinguish between national and cross-border procurement strategies? Because I'm asking, given 2 reasons. Post-Brexit, it's going to be changes in the dynamics of public procurement here, and also how increasingly inward-looking countries have become, and the potential implications on trade and capital mobility.
Okay.
And one up front.
Yeah, the lady here as well.
I see. Sorry.
Oh, there's another one. Yes.
Lingering hand in the back.
Yes.
Go for it, briefly.
Briefly, very struck that you suggest that there's perhaps too much regulation in high-income countries, given that in the United States, where I'm from, the complaint is always, whether you're talking about pharma or oil or defense especially, that there's too little regulation because the lobbying operation is too good. So I wonder how you'd incorporate that context to what you've said about how regulation is just a means for a few companies to raise barriers to entry.
Yep.
Okay. That lady here.
Hi, I have loads of questions, but I'm just going to stick to one. You got your data from businesses, right? And I wonder whether there are other types of transparency data that are available from other sources. So, for example, data about the process by which decisions are made and who is in the room that are available in some countries but not in others.
Okay. And the gentleman here in front.
It's coming. And Erica would help me with answering some of these, and she's writing them down.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a very enlightening talk. I have 2 small questions. One is, there are built-in delays in the regulatory processes in different countries. At least in my country, the process itself, you know, entails that there would be overruns and that there would be, you know, draft delays. How do you manage, and you know, how did you compare the regulations between countries, even if they're in the same income bracket? And number 2, what were the procurements of goods, services, and for that matter, other you know, procurements, infrastructure and other work? So because each country has a different paradigm for these procurements. So you're only concerned about building a 20-kilometer road, but there are, you know, different paradigms for procurement of services and procurement of goods. And these might be different when it comes to other countries.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll go quickly, and then Erica would help me with some, because her and her team put together the data and the main analysis. So I'll go not chronologically to make it more fun for you. So lobbying. We haven't looked at specific lobbying regulation. Actually, that's as a result of this project, we are starting a much bigger project which relates to some of the questions of the lady there and your question of how does the government regulate itself or its behavior in some other fields, not even economic fields, because I suggest we started with basic economics and now we're moving much more towards political science, if you like. So there are some other areas where the government should, in principle, be regulating well its own behavior. So lobbying is one. Elections, actually, is another. Somebody was wondering why in the US the particular government now thinks that we should cut regulations. So we want to understand how governments actually run elections to be in government and whether there is something peculiar, similar or not similar to what we do. But to answer specifically the question, no, we don't look at lobbying per se. It's one of our analyses because, as you said, there is a very rich lobbying literature, not so much in economics, although we do have it as well, but in political science that says this matters a lot, so you should look at it. The results that we can come up, especially in rich countries, certainly bring us very closely to this literature, because it cannot be that rich, efficient countries get such terrible outcomes of regulation. It must be that somehow the business community, or particular parts of the business community, is helping this inefficient process. And notice that maybe the same is happening in middle income and poor countries. They're just so inefficient that they cannot get even the bad outcome. So not just the government is inefficient, the private sector is also inefficient to getting the bad outcome. But I think we'll end up exactly where you anticipate we will end up, and kind of more with the political structure, the first question and one of the other questions. The third question on, the second question on, well, have we considered the different paths, if you like, that governments can regulate? So Eric would have a great answer to that, because again, our legal team has thought a lot about and has actually described the process. So we asked the private sector and we asked the public sector. And connected to the transparency question, we actually don't just ask people, but on some issues like transparency, where it says 01, is the initial announcement, if you like, for this procurement project online or not, we actually check. Is it that anybody can go and get it from the Ministry of Infrastructure? This is where the 160 offices of the World Bank are. We send somebody to check. So actually on a number of these things, we don't just follow the law. We actually in practice go, our team goes and actually tries to do what the regulation is. So, and we follow the different types of paths to get to what seems to be the most prevalent path by regulation. On the question of the US environmental regulation and so on, other regulations that now are under threat in a number of areas, you mentioned oil and so on. So this is why I stated, when we started this project, our research design actually was, in a way, very naive. We thought that OECD countries for sure will get the regulation right, and we would set up kind of a base efficient model, and then we'll be looking for middle income and poor countries, how far they are from this model. So this was how we designed the project. And when we get these results and we find exactly the opposite is the case, which kind of throws everything in the air and ask this more basic question, maybe even in the countries that we thought are regulating well, they're just overdoing it. If this is what this suggests. If they're overdoing it, we have the next question, but we don't have yet an answer. Maybe the lobbying is the way to go, of why. How is it that like reasonably high human capital countries, reasonably non-corrupt countries on other indicators and so on, why is it that regulation is so much more, if you like, and doesn't get the outcome? And there we are still in the kind of, this is why the paper is not here yet, because we're trying to figure out how to write that out. So maybe the people who are doing the regulation, and historically actually, you can think of such cases where we are very convinced for a long period of time that the Earth was flat, and suddenly we found, well, actually the Earth is not flat, but it took many, many burned people and heretics and non-heretics to get that. So maybe in this area and in other areas we're like all wrong. So all that we thought and that you are taught in other schools, not at the Blavatnik School, is just plain wrong. And you know, Stefan's new course will teach you the right way. In principle, that's actually possible. It's happened in human history. It wouldn't be the first time. So hopefully that project kind of creates excitement for others to look at. And then the last question on, there surely are many other areas, as you said, services. I mean, this is a particular very simple project, but you can think of many other. And I'm not even touching defense spending, which I can imagine the inefficiencies and the huge bribes and so on. So there are many other areas that we are not looking. The reason that we looked at, so I don't have a good answer to your question, sorry. The reason that we look at this is precisely because it's so simple, you know, and you see it. So many other areas you can argue, is this the right weaponry system or is this not the right weaponry system? Do we really have a shield or we don't have a shield? Is this the right drug or is this not the right drug? Here it's kind of difficult to argue that this is not the right road, because many people and over many centuries, starting from the Romans, know how to build roads. And we can see it from the sky, still fail. So it must be that in everything else it's more complicated, more screwed up, and so on. Erica, quickly on the others, please. So we should just give you the...
So on
the question of how we deal with different types of procurement methods. So we essentially looked at all the possible paths, the one that would happen most commonly in practice. So that could be restricted tendering, framework agreements, reverse auctions, like the gentleman mentioned. But then we also looked at one standardized type, assuming that everything goes through an open tendering procedure where anyone can compete. I think that was the only question that was left.
Oh, you skipped a few questions, including his first question. That's very nice, very Italian, which is why regulation in Italy doesn't quite work.
I think, I'm afraid, running out of time, also the live streaming needs to come to an end. So I don't think you've said that we should give up on basic open tendering and basic minimal standards of the thing. But I think what I found very interesting, and just seeing this when I was working in the Department of International Development, so a UK government department, where with the intention to try to create more competition, all kinds of rules were invented that actually now ended up in, okay, I'm saying this quite publicly now, official secrets acts should probably stop me from doing this, but it's absolute mess if what's going on. And so it's actually this, everybody asks for more regulation because they see a mess, but actually the problem may well be sitting is that it made it so complicated that only some of the very biggest firms only can bid for the contract. I remember here in the university, after I left as chief economist to DFID, and I feel myself stupid having allowed it to happen, I ended up having to bid for a research tender, and I couldn't understand the tender documents. They were so complicated that you could actually not anymore tender. So it meant only PwC, KPMG, and a few other friends probably could end up doing it. And I think that's the kind of thing where we need to think very carefully about this mixture between the practical regulation and the theory where it is here. So anyway, this was a great talk. Thank you, Simeon and Erica, for being here. And I'll give, thank you, usually. Thank you very much.
Thank you.